Hey team, Andre from High Performance Academy here. Welcome along to another one of our webinars. Today we're going to be diving into the world of power distribution modules. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the ECU Master PMU16. We've got two of those fitted to our own Toyota 86 here, fitted with our SR20 VE turbo engine. We're going to have a look at some of the aspects of how these units work, the inputs, the outputs, and the various ways that we can configure their operation. Before we get into that though, I just wanted to cover a few things that have been happening over the last couple of weeks since our last webinar. And last webinar sort of was on a bit of a high. We just had the first round of our South Island Endurance Series Championship, and we come away with a win in the 1 hour class, so we're pretty happy with that. I also did mention though that on the Sunday we had a club day sprint race at Highlands Motorsport Park, which didn't quite go so well. We had, in short, just to recap, a bit of a regulator failure on our alternator, resulted in the alternator overcharging, which in turn ended up spiking the voltage too high, which caused a fault with the ABS unit. Big spin, no real damage, and we obviously needed to resolve that before we went to our second round of racing. So in terms of the fix for that, it was a bit multifaceted here. First of all, we ditched the LS alternator which we were running on the car. We've had a few challenges with this particular vehicle because it is a little bit unique. One of the things that is problematic with the Toyota 86 is that it does run the electric power steer system. Not that's completely unusual, but one of the aspects with the electric power steer unit is that it does have a very high current draw. So between that, the multiple pumps, between fuel as well as gearbox and diff pumps, fans, etc., there was actually quite a large current draw on this. So we'd originally run an SR20 alternator which really struggled, moved to the LS which has enough current output, but we did find some reliability problems with that. Once we found these problems, of course a bunch of other people then piped up to tell us that they'd also had similar failures with the LS alternator in race conditions. So anyway, looking at our options, it was actually relatively straightforward to go back to running the Toyota FA20 alternator. One of the, I guess you could call it a pro and a con with that, is that it does run computer control of the alternator charging. So it doesn't use a conventional sense wire. Instead, it does run its own charging setup. So if we just come across to my laptop screen here, and I'll just try and show you this very briefly. This is the Motec M1 software that we use for tuning it. And here we've got our alternator control. So we're just using a spare injector output to control the alternator. And basically what we can do here is set a target battery voltage. So this is the target voltage. This goes, we've purposely actually gone just a little bit higher, which we'll get onto in a moment. Normally this would be probably 14 volts, and we expect the charging system to be between about 13.8 and about 14.2 when the engine's running. This actually runs a PID control or PI control. So we've got our proportional and our integral gain. We're actually only running integral as part of this. So basically, if there's an error between our target battery voltage and the actual battery voltage, what the ECU will do is control the duty cycle being sent to the alternator in order to correct that. And all things considered, it actually works really well. So once we got that all on the car, we headed to Highlands on our way to round 2, which we've just had on the weekend, to test that out. I just want to show you through some data. So for a start, this is what we were faced with once we got back out on the track. So the good news was that the ABS was working fine, obviously a bit of a concern, but this is our battery voltage here. This is one of the channels that we're monitoring, and we can see that for the most part it's sitting at about 14.2. The highest voltage it's registered during that session, 14.4 volts. So nothing specifically wrong with that, but we do have some of these worrying little drops here. We've got a couple that are obvious in this. Now this one here is interesting because we can see really clearly that it coincides with the diff pump turning on. So for endurance racing, because we're doing a lot of laps, the gearbox and the differential do end up getting pretty hot. So we've got an external oil cooler and we use a pump once the temperature temperature gets above about 70 degrees C, that switches on. So what we can see here, particularly if we look at the current from the diff pump, we're going to be getting deeper into this as we go through today's actual webinar as well, because this is a big aspect of how power distribution modules work. But we can see that the actual switch on current, well, they call it inrush current. If we just zoom in a little bit here, we're hitting about 20.8 is actually the peak current draw that occurs when that diff pump turns on. Quite dramatically different to the steady state condition. It drops back to 5 to 6 amps, and actually once the oil's up to a slightly higher temperature, it actually sits there about 2 to 3 amps, so not a huge amount of current draw. So that load obviously does cause quite a draw from the battery. The problem with this is we are seeing a minimum voltage there dropping down to 12.68 volts, which is way lower than what I'd personally like to see. Now, there are some other aspects here that are occurring that aren't captured in this log. Specifically for the paddle shifted Hollinger gearbox, we've got an air compressor that is switching on and off multiple times. That is another really high current draw. That has an inrush current as high as 80 to 90 amps and a continuous operating current of about 20. That's happening during this log file, which we aren't capturing, unfortunately, in this particular log. So anyway, not ideal. The reason that I say it's not ideal is we have had other ABS-related issues when the voltage drops below 12.5. So when we're at 12.6, 12.7, it's dangerously close to 12.5 and way lower than I'd like it to be. One of the changes we made to get around this, which again, we're going to deal with as we go through today's actual webinar topic of power distribution module and calibration of those, tuning of those, is we switched to what is called soft start for the compressor for the paddle shift system. So basically, instead of just switching that straight on and getting that huge high inrush current, what it does is it pulse width modulates the output over a brief period of time, in this case about 0.4 of a second, 400 milliseconds, and it ramps it up to full operation. So basically it gets around that inrush current. And if we just grab some other data here, once we actually got to levels Raceway, this is what everything look like here. So much better. We can see that we're varying between about 13.7 and about 14.8 volts there in our charging voltage. We're sitting right on our target there of 14.5. I'd also made a bit of a change to the integral gain there just to smooth out. It was a little bit wavy there with the actual voltage, so just a little bit of tuning there helped improve that. So we've still got some dips there, but much improved compared to what we saw. So basically went into the weekend pretty happy with how that was all going to work. Now, with round 2 of our South Island Endurance Series racing, we were going to Levels Raceway in Timaru. This was my first visit there. I've never turned a lap there, and we had a relatively short amount of time to get up to speed with the racetrack, and that was our test day, which was on Friday. We had 3 45-minute sessions, and one of the things that we did rely on quite heavily here, or I relied on quite heavily here, was simulator practice. So if I just jump across to my laptop screen, I used the rFactor 2 here. Normally I use iRacing on my home sim, but unfortunately iRacing only laser scans tracks, and hence we're only getting big name tracks. Timaru, Levels Raceway at Timaru is a bit of a club level track, and yeah, obviously it's not going to be something that's captured by iRacing. So rFactor 2 actually found out a set of course that actually also covers levels, and basically probably put in about 300 laps over the 2 weeks leading up to Timaru, and got to a point where I was pretty comfortable with the track layout, and pleasantly surprised that when I got to the track, the time that I put in on the sim really did pay dividends. And basically within the first 45-minute session, I was basically on the pace there, and within about 0.3 of a second of my best lap time. So for those who are wondering, does a simulator actually help? Yes, 100%. Particularly there's an infield section of that track that is quite tricky. There's not a lot of high speed at Timaru. It's all quite sort of flowy, tricky stuff, and basically it's a combination of corners where if you mess up one corner, that kind of flows on and it really messes up the next 3 corners. So it really is quite critical to get that right. So just having an understanding of the layout and the flow of the track really did give me a big benefit there. One other thing I do, and we cover this in detail, both the simulators and basically onboard video, the options that are available, how to learn a track. in our race driving fundamentals course. If you are interested in learning more, you can find that at hpacademy.com/courses. And that course we cover using onboard video. I did that as well. Lots of YouTube videos from Levels Raceway. I ended up spending some time watching a Toyota Racing Series car going around there, just again getting an idea of where to be, where to position the car, and basically the correct lines. And I also spent some time after my first session out on the track there. I actually went and watched the GT3 cars going through one tricky section of track where the hairpin was, just seeing what they were doing, their lines, etc. So there is a lot to learn before you actually ever get out on the racetrack yourself, and all of those things really speed up your learning and can really pay dividends when it comes time to get your first laps out on track. So the good news was everything sort of worked really well on the test day, and by the time we bolted some fresh tires on for qualifying, pretty happy with my results. And again, on my laptop screen here, we've got we're in Class B, which is the faster of the two classes in our category. So I ended up coming in P2, less than 2/100ths of a second behind Reese, who was in P1. So I was pretty happy with that. One of the problems with the race format that we've got is that it is very condensed. We've got 2 1-hour races and a 3-hour race all in one day, plus qualifying sessions for all of those races. This means that we only get a 15-minute qualifying session. It's very difficult within that 15 minutes even to get a clean lap because of the slower cars out there on track. It's very easy to be on a good lap and end up coming up on a slower car, and basically you have to throw the lap away. So one of the things that we have gone to in order to get us the best chance of getting a good lap time is tyre warmers. Normally you'd probably think of these as a big ticket item. We're actually using some that are sourced out of China, and this whole package was about 1,500 New Zealand dollars. So what's that, maybe about 800 or 900 US dollars. And for that investment, I personally think it's well worthwhile. What that allowed us to do is get the tyre warmers on the car about 2 hours before our qualifying session was ready to start, and the tread temperature of the tyres up to about 75 degrees by the time we actually roll out of pit lane, which means that you can get on it straight away. Otherwise, I'd waste another 3 laps, probably about 4.5 minutes of that session just getting heat into the tyres. So yeah, worth their weight in gold, I think, if you are in this level of competition. Another often overlooked aspect of this as well is that it actually can help improve the life of your tyres. So basically started P2, but the guy who qualified ahead of me, he actually broke an axle in qualifying. By the time they got that fixed, he missed the pit lane closing to get out on track, which meant he had to start from pit lane. So I was sitting essentially in P1, which gave us a pretty good start. And as we can see here on my laptop screen, managed to get ahead of the TCRs. So the 2 cars behind me there are both TCRs. So a bit of a battle there with David versus Goliath. I think we have got more power than them, but anytime you're trying to beat a factory built race car with a home built car is a little bit challenging. So that's how everything started out. Got a little bit optimistic on lap 1, and through the later part of the track I did have a little bit of a slide. I've got a quick video that we'll just play here, and yeah, had a little bit of a slide, and unfortunately let Scott, who's coming out behind me there, just get past. So you see the back of the car wiggle around a little bit there. So he got past me there. That's about 6 corners in, so not too far into the track. However, used another little trick that we have up our sleeve. We'll just go to this video here, which is in car. So this is basically following on. There's Scott going past me there. So follow him for the next couple of corners, coming up to a relatively slow speed hairpin corner here. And what I was trying to do is position myself so I could get a good run out of here. And this left-hander leads on to basically a start-finish straight. I mean, out of here at full throttle, and you see I just hit the push to pass button here. Let's just watch that again, and I'll just explain what's happening here. So this little button up here that I've just highlighted with the cursor there, that's my push to pass button. You see I'll press that in a second, and what that does is it takes us from 15 psi boost up to 18 psi, and that gives me about another 60 or 70 horsepower, just enough to basically close it on Scott pretty easily coming into the braking zone for turn 1. So I managed to get past Scott there. He left enough of a gap, and basically if there's a gap there, I was going to take it. So back into the lead coming into the start of lap 2. However, it wasn't going to continue like that, unfortunately, because next thing we had a failure, and we ended up being put back on the end of a flat deck truck. So what happened going through the third turn is this little component here that I've got in front of me, this failed. So this is a stud that links the factory hub or upright on the front of the car to the lower control arm. So I've got a couple of photos here just to explain what's happening. So probably a little difficult to show you on camera, but if we look at this here, we can actually see this has been a failure that's been happening for some time. There's a bit of a fatigue related to this. That's how the component sits there. So basically we've had to cut it to get it out, but there is a taper here that fits into the standard taper that the lower ball joint fits into in the stock vehicle. Now, the problem as we see it, I think, is twofold. First of all, there is a design or engineering flaw in this, which unfortunately is unavoidable. I'll explain that in a minute. But we can see here that is this line. This is a clear indication of where that taper's actually been sitting in the hub. This indicates that probably the taper machined onto this component here doesn't actually perfectly match the taper inside of the hub, which is a big no-no. If we look at the hub, we can also see basically the same match marks there, showing that we weren't getting full engagement in that taper. So basically it's been sitting at the top of that unit there, and this part here has been supported, and basically we've got massive loads going into the bottom of the stud, and that's just basically creating a bending force. Now, while there is a problem there potentially with this taper, ultimately this is a design flaw, and it's one of those things that happens when we are trying to use a production part in a motorsport application. So let me just go back to my notes here for a moment, and we'll just bring in, all right, let's head over to my laptop screen here. So this is how it really should be done. This is a proper motorsport upright. So while we're not a double wishbone suspension system here, this essentially is the same as our lower spherical bearing on our lower control arm. And this is what is referred to as double shear. So we can see that the upright here actually continues around and encapsulates the lower ball joint, lower spherical bearing, and basically what would happen is that a bolt would go down through this component here. So this puts the spherical bearing in double shear, much stronger than single shear, which is what we've got, where essentially there's no support. This is also shown here with this component here, which is for our steering tie rod. Again, in a motorsport application, it's put in double shear. So it's much stronger and also removes a lot of compliance there. So everything's actually much more rigid. But again, unfortunately, this is something that's really not feasible while we are working with the factory upright. All isn't lost though. While it was really frustrating retiring from the lead of the race on only lap 2, we do have to look at the positives in that that component has been in the car for about 3 seasons now. We've highlighted there is a design flaw which we can correct. We can also go to a larger diameter. We're actually going to end up machining that taper out of the hub and stepping up the diameter of that component. Ultimately, we'll also put a life on that component as well, and perhaps it's going to get replaced now every season of racing. So yeah, a lot of lessons to take away, but the positives were that we were on the pace pretty much straight away, and we were on the pace at a track that we'd never been to. So we've got a week turnaround now for our next event, and looking forward to seeing how we go at a racetrack. It's probably a little bit more suited to the power advantage that our car has, and also a track that I've turned a fair few laps at now. All right, next I just want to head across and just quickly cover off an Instagram that got a fair bit of traction that we posted up last week. And this is actually something that I snapped a photo of, I think it was over at TX2K a while back. And this is a hidden nitrous system. So this is inside of a Plasma Man billet CNC machined alloy intake manifold. I think off the top of my head this was probably for an LS, but the interesting part here is this hidden nitrous installation. So you can see we've got here two jets, one is for nitrous and one is for fuel, and obviously when this is all assembled those jets end up basically stuck right down the port, so they're delivering the nitrous and fuel directly where it needs to go. There's a fairly intricate web of rails in here to supply the fuel and nitrous, and the idea here of course is this is a complete stealth system. The only obvious connection, if you're really looking for it, is that the nitrous and the fuel would need to be plumbed up to this. Now, a couple of things I just want to mention here. So nitrous, first of all, in a really brief aspect, how does this work? I know a lot of people think that it's cheating, and when we see a hidden system like this, well, you do have to question that to a degree. The reality is, though, that nitrous is just another form of power adder, and it has its own challenges and it has its own pros and cons, just like forced induction, like a turbocharger or a supercharger. It also requires a fair bit of management. So the idea here is it's essentially chemical supercharging. We are simply adding oxygen directly via the nitrous straight into the cylinder, and basically nitrous is nitrogen and oxygen, and when they go through the combustion process the two dissociate from each other. The nitrogen passes through the combustion chamber. Basically it's an inert gas, it doesn't do anything, but the oxygen is the key there. This then allows us to add more fuel, creating a larger combustion event. That is how we get more power. So a couple of things there though. One is that we do need to add fuel, so that's why this is what is referred to as a wet system. It is injecting both the nitrous and the fuel together. It's not the only way to do it. My own personal preference is, as provided we've got a sufficient injector headroom, I actually prefer to do this using the fuel system on an EFI car. And the reason I like this is because it gives a little bit more control over the amount of fuel, as opposed to being limited simply by the size of jet we're using. There are ways of combining both though. We can use a wet system where we have the fuel jet and then make further trims to our main fuel delivery when the nitrous is active to get our air-fuel ratio where we want it to go. So that's the first thing. That's how we're getting the nitrous and fuel into the engine. But the other aspect with this particular system is it's what's referred to as direct ports. So that's where we have a nitrous and fuel jet for each of the cylinders, and this allows a little bit more precision with how the fuel and nitrous is added, making sure that the distribution is nice and even. It's probably not such a big deal if we're looking at a small kit, maybe 50 to 100 horsepower, but once we start stepping up to 200, 300, 400 horsepower, it's a huge increase in fuel and nitrous that's being provided, and we want to make sure that that is evenly supplied to all of the cylinders. And again, once everything's installed here and the plenum is bolted together, that by virtue of the location of those jets ensures that the nitrous and fuel is only going where it's going to go, where it's supposed to go. So again, nitrous, it's not cheating, it is just another form of power adder, and it requires just as much understanding of what you're doing as it does tuning a turbocharged or a supercharged engine. Lastly for today, I just wanted to briefly again mention our HPA Tuned In podcast. We're super proud of this podcast and the guests that we have been attracting. Our latest release here is a interview with Tony Palo. Tony's already been a guest on our in-person interviews a number of times. He is the brains behind T1 Race over in Texas, building some of the world's fastest GT-Rs, among other vehicles as well. He's also the other half of Injector Dynamics, along with Paul pull yaw. Specifically, one of the interesting things that we talked to Tony about here is the development of the R35 platform. And I talked to him here, and something I found really interesting was the use of billet blocks. And these days we hear a lot of people talking about billet blocks, and it's assumed that in most high power applications that it isn't essential. And these R35 GT-Rs now, many of them punching out 2.5 to 3,000 plus horsepower. It's a huge amount of power. One of the interesting aspects there was Tony said right at the early stages of their development, they made the decision to go to a Darden style mid sleeve. And what they found is that with those sleeved blocks, which is a really common process with an alloy block, once they got up to about 1600 horsepower, they started having failures where the blocks were essentially splitting in half along the bottom of the bores. There's a casting line in the block there. So they did go to billet, but at some point Tony decided to revisit the stock block, given that they'd actually never had a failure of the stock sleeve. And he's actually produced engines that have made 2,500 horsepower on the stock non-sleeved Nissan block, which I think most people would probably have assumed is not possible. So Tony's take on that is that the reason that they use the billet blocks is not so much that the factory block is lacking strength, but more because the billet block allows them to go to the larger bore diameters for their 4.1 litre builds, which is really important when they're starting to run those larger turbos. So if you're interested in learning more, make sure you check out that podcast. You'll find it wherever you already listen to podcasts. You can also check it out at hpa-tunedin.com. That's the page I'm on right there. We've got some really interesting guests covering a wide range of different topics. We've got some really cool guests coming up as well. So really excited to get some more content out on that channel. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a rating and a review if you can. We'd really appreciate it. It will help us reach more and more people with that podcast. All right, we'll leave it there for today. Thanks for watching. Give me a moment and we'll get started with today's lesson.
If you like that video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you're not already a subscriber, make sure you're subscribed. We release a new video every week. And if you like free stuff, we've got a great deal for you. Click the link in the description to claim your free spot to our next live lesson.